He just wanted meat, but fate delivered him to an Apache woman. Born in a small, quiet town on the edge of the Arizona Territory, he grew up watching his father trap animals and hunt for food, skills that seemed ordinary to the townsfolk, but were vital to survival in the vast, untamed land. From a young age, John felt a strange comfort in the solitude of the forests and deserts. While other boys ran through streets or played games, he preferred the whisper of the wind through the pine trees, the crunch of leaves under his boots, and the distant calls of birds and animals that no one else noticed. To him, the wild was not frightening. It was a companion, a teacher, and sometimes the only friend he needed. By the time John was 25, he had spent most of his life alone. He built a modest cabin on a small plot of land, not far from the river, where he could fish and gather water. His home was simple, with walls made of timber he had cut himself and a fireplace that provided warmth during the cold desert nights. The cabin was more than shelter. It was a reflection of his independence and his ability to survive in a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. Yet, despite his solitude, John had a routine and a sense of purpose. Every morning he would check his traps, mend his tools, and plan his hunts carefully, knowing that one careless mistake could cost him dearly. On a crisp morning in late October, John woke before the sun rose. The air was cold, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and the earthy aroma of the forest floor. He dressed in layers of rough cloth and leather, fastening his worn boots tightly. Today, he decided, he would hunt. He needed meat not just for himself but to store for the coming winter. The thought of empty shelves and cold nights spurred him into action. He packed his rifle, some dried bread, a small pouch of salt, and a few personal items into his worn leather satchel. His mind was focused and calm. Hunting was both work and meditation for him, a way to test his skill, patience, and understanding of the land. As John stepped out of his cabin, the first rays of the sun stretched across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The forest seemed alive, the gentle rustling of leaves and distant calls of animals creating a symphony that only someone who lived close to the earth could fully appreciate. He moved quietly, knowing that any loud sound might scare away the deer he hoped to catch. His eyes scanned the ground for tracks, his ears tuned to the faintest whisper of movement. This was a dance he knew well, the rhythm of observation, patience, and careful calculation. Hours passed as he trekked deeper into the forest. He followed the tracks of a deer, careful to move silently over rocks and fallen branches. The sun climbed higher, and the forest's warmth slowly replaced the chill of the morning. Birds flitted through the trees, and small animals scurried across the forest floor, alert to his presence yet largely uninterested in him. John felt a sense of connection with the land, a bond forged through years of observation and understanding. Every rustle, every shadow, every scent told a story, and he could read it like an open book. Despite his experience, hunting was never easy. Hours passed, and the deer remained elusive. Frustration began to creep into John's mind, though he forced himself to remain calm. He reminded himself that patience was key, that rushing or forcing the hunt would only result in failure. He slowed his pace, crouching behind a fallen log, observing the clearing ahead. A faint movement caught his eye, a flash of brown between the trees. He froze, heart pounding, as the animal appeared briefly before disappearing into the underbrush. John knew the forest could be both generous and unforgiving. Today, it seemed determined to test him. He pressed on, navigating through thickets and across shallow streams, always alert, always listening. The hours stretched into the afternoon, and his stomach reminded him of the need for sustenance, but he refused to turn back empty-handed. Hunting was not just about filling his own belly. It was about survival, preparation, and respect for the balance of life. Taking only what he needed and doing so carefully had been instilled in him by his father, and he honored that lesson every time he hunted. By late afternoon, John realized he had wandered into unfamiliar territory. The forest here was denser, the terrain rougher, with sharp rocks and tangled roots that made walking difficult. He paused on a small hill, looking around, trying to recognize familiar landmarks. Nothing looked familiar. A slight pang of anxiety stirred within him, a reminder that even the most experienced outdoorsman could become lost if he was not careful. Yet, John was determined. He took a deep breath, steadied his nerves, and continued moving forward, confident that his skills and knowledge would guide him. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The temperature dropped, and a chill ran through John's body, reminding him that winter was approaching quickly. He realized he needed to find both game and a safe place to rest before darkness fell. Every sound seemed louder now, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of a branch under some unseen creature's weight. The solitude he usually cherished now carried an edge of tension. The forest was beautiful, but it was also a place of hidden dangers, and John felt the weight of responsibility for his own survival more keenly than ever. As evening approached, John stumbled upon a small clearing. He crouched behind a large rock, scanning the area for signs of deer or other animals. A faint trail of tracks led off into the underbrush, and he decided to follow them carefully. His stomach growled, but he resisted eating yet. He wanted to stay alert and focused. The forest seemed to close in around him, trees standing tall like silent guardians, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. John felt a mix of awe and humility. Nature was magnificent, but it demanded respect, and he had learned that the hard way many times in his life. By twilight, John had still not secured any game. The deer had vanished, leaving him with only the sounds of the evening forest for company. He knew he needed to make a decision: continue the hunt and risk getting lost in the growing darkness, or find a place to rest and try again in the morning. He chose the latter, recognizing that caution was often wiser than pride. He spotted a shallow depression near a cluster of trees and decided it would serve as a temporary resting spot. He built a small fire with dry twigs and leaves, careful to keep it contained, and allowed himself a brief meal of bread while listening to the forest settle into night. As he sat by the fire, John reflected on the day. Hunting was not merely a task. It was a test of patience, observation, and endurance. He thought of his father and the lessons passed down over the years: how to read animal tracks, how to move quietly, how to respect the land and its creatures. Despite the frustrations, John felt a deep sense of connection to the world around him, a bond that grew stronger each time he faced the challenges of the wilderness. By the time the moon rose high in the sky, John lay down near his small fire, wrapped in his cloak. The sounds of the forest lulled him toward sleep: the gentle rustling of leaves, the distant calls of nocturnal animals, and the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. He felt a mixture of exhaustion and satisfaction, knowing that he had survived another day in the wild, relying solely on his wits, his skills, and his knowledge of the land. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep and undisturbed, preparing him for whatever the forest would demand of him the next day. Unbeknownst to John, this hunt, intended simply to provide meat for his table, was about to lead him into a world far beyond anything he had experienced. The forest held more than deer and rabbits. It held the unknown, the unexpected, and the beginnings of a story that would forever change the course of his life. The next morning, John awoke to the faint glow of dawn filtering through the trees. The forest was quiet, almost still, and the cool air carried the scent of damp earth and pine needles. He stretched, feeling the stiffness in his muscles from the long hike the day before, and rubbed the sleep from his eyes. The fire he had built last night had burned down to glowing embers, and he carefully stirred them to warm himself before beginning the day. Today, he knew, would be another test of patience, skill, and endurance. After a quick breakfast of bread and a few wild berries he had gathered nearby, John slung his rifle over his shoulder and checked the traps he had set along the forest edge. He had learned long ago that survival depended on careful planning. The traps were simple but effective, made from cord and bent branches, placed in locations where animals were likely to pass. He inspected each one meticulously, repairing and adjusting them where needed. To John, these small acts of preparation were as important as the hunt itself. They represented the difference between an empty stomach and a meal, between safety and vulnerability. Once he was satisfied with his traps, he set out deeper into the forest, following a faint trail he had noticed the day before. The ground was soft with fallen leaves, and the trees seemed to lean close together, forming a natural tunnel that guided his path. Every sound and movement caught his attention: the snapping of twigs underfoot, the distant call of a hawk, the rustling of leaves as a small animal scurried away. John moved slowly, deliberately, understanding that any misstep could spook the deer or other game he hoped to find. Hours passed with little success. The deer tracks he had followed the previous day seemed to vanish, leaving him with only a feeling of unease. He paused by a small stream to drink and rest, kneeling at the water's edge and cupping his hands to bring the cool water to his lips. As he gazed at his reflection in the moving surface, he saw a man tired but determined, a man who had learned to trust his instincts and rely on his own abilities. Still, he could not shake the growing awareness that he had wandered far from familiar territory. The trees here were taller, the underbrush thicker, and the terrain more uneven. He realized that even the most experienced woodsman could become lost if he was not careful. Determined to continue, John moved on, keeping a careful eye on his surroundings. He noticed subtle signs of life that others might miss. A broken branch that suggested a deer had passed by recently, faint tracks of rabbits near the stream, and the occasional scat of larger animals further in the forest. Each observation was like a piece of a puzzle, helping him understand the land and the creatures that inhabited it. He felt a thrill at the challenge. Hunting was not merely about killing an animal, but about reading the forest, learning its rhythms, and moving in harmony with it. As the sun climbed higher, John's stomach reminded him that it had been hours since his last meal. He paused to eat a small portion of bread, washed down with more water from the stream. Even as he ate, he remained alert, scanning the forest for movement. The longer he moved through this unfamiliar terrain, the more he realized how little he truly knew about this part of the wilderness. Every tree and rock seemed foreign, every sound strange. The feeling of unease grew, but he pushed it aside, focusing on the task at hand. Hunger, he reminded himself, was nothing compared to the risk of losing his way entirely. By midday, John had noticed a subtle change in the forest. The light filtering through the trees shifted, creating patterns that played tricks on the eyes. Shadows moved where no wind stirred, and the air seemed heavier, carrying scents he did not recognize. He paused on a ridge, looking down into a valley that stretched before him. It was beautiful, almost breathtaking, but it also carried an unfamiliar danger. He scanned the area for signs of other humans, knowing that travelers and settlers occasionally moved through these woods, and not all of them were friendly. Yet there was no one in sight, only the quiet, endless forest. Despite the beauty, a sense of anxiety began to settle over John. He realized he had been so focused on hunting that he had not paid attention to landmarks that could help him navigate back. The trees here were too similar, the rocks too alike, and the trails he had followed were faint and easy to lose. He paused to consider his options, retrace his steps, which might take hours, or continue in hopes of finding game and a more familiar path. The decision weighed on him, but he trusted his instincts. He chose to continue, believing that the forest would reveal its secrets to those who paid attention. As the afternoon wore on, John's patience was tested. The deer seemed to elude him at every turn. He crouched behind rocks, moved silently through thickets, and even attempted to mimic the calls of animals to lure them closer. Hours passed with no success. Hunger gnawed at him, fatigue pressed against his muscles, and the shadows lengthened. Still, he pressed on, knowing that giving up was not an option. Survival required persistence, and he was determined to endure. In the late afternoon, John's attention was caught by a faint movement among the trees. He froze, heart racing, as he watched a figure move gracefully through the underbrush. It was small and human, but he could not see clearly from the distance. His instincts told him to be cautious, and he crouched low, watching as the figure disappeared behind a dense cluster of trees. John's curiosity and caution battled within him. Who or what had been there? The forest was supposed to be empty, yet now he realized that he was not entirely alone. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, John faced a difficult choice. Night was approaching, and he had no clear path back to his cabin. The forest, which had seemed familiar at dawn, now felt like a labyrinth. Every step seemed uncertain, every sound potentially dangerous. He decided to set up a temporary camp, finding a small clearing near a stream where he could rest and regain his strength. He gathered dry wood and built a fire, careful to keep it small but sufficient for warmth and protection. The forest around him seemed to settle as the day faded, but the awareness that he was far from familiar territory lingered. Sitting by the fire, John reflected on his situation. Hunting had brought him here, but it had also exposed his vulnerability. The forest, which he loved and respected, could be unforgiving. He thought of his father and the lessons he had learned about preparation, patience, and awareness. Those lessons had kept him alive so far, but now he realized that experience alone might not be enough. The world was larger and more complex than he had anticipated, and even a skilled woodsman could find himself at the mercy of circumstances beyond his control. Night fell completely, and the forest transformed. Sounds of nocturnal creatures filled the air, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of small animals, and the occasional snap of a branch in the distance. John kept his rifle close, ready to defend himself if needed. Sleep was difficult to come by. The uncertainty of the forest and the knowledge that he was far from home made his mind restless. He lay near the fire, listening to the night, trying to calm his thoughts. The forest was both beautiful and threatening, and he understood that respect and caution were his best allies. Hours later, as he drifted into a light sleep, John's thoughts were filled with questions. Would he find his way back? Would he secure enough food before nightfall? And who or what had moved through the trees earlier? The forest held answers, but they were not easily revealed. He knew that tomorrow would demand courage, skill, and careful attention, and he steeled himself for the challenges that lay ahead. Unseen by John, the forest around him was not as empty as it seemed. Small eyes watched from the shadows, and faint movements suggested that life in the wilderness was alert and aware. The day's struggles had only begun to test him, and the events that were about to unfold would change his understanding of survival, trust, and human connection. For now, he remained unaware of the encounter that fate had set in motion, unaware that the simple hunt for meat had led him to a path he could never have imagined. The morning after his long, restless night, John awoke to the gentle light of dawn streaming through the trees. The fire he had left burning had mostly died down, leaving only smoldering embers that glowed softly. The forest was alive with sound. Birds chirped in the distance, the rustle of small animals moved through the underbrush, and a cool breeze carried the earthy scent of fallen leaves and wet soil. John stretched and took a deep breath. He knew he had to continue his search for food, but he also realized he had to pay careful attention to where he was going. The forest, beautiful though it was, had already proven that it could be confusing and unpredictable. With a firm grip on his rifle and a careful eye on the ground, John began to move through the trees. Every step was deliberate, every sound noticed. His senses, sharpened by years of experience, were alert to the slightest movement. Yet despite his attention, he could not shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A tingle at the back of his neck, the sense that the forest was more alive than he had realized. He told himself it was simply his imagination, the product of isolation and fatigue, but the feeling persisted, urging him to remain cautious. As he moved deeper into the woods, John noticed a narrow path that seemed less overgrown than the rest of the forest floor. It wound through tall trees and dense underbrush, and though it appeared natural, it bore signs that someone, or something, had used it recently. Broken twigs, faint footprints, and a small clearing ahead caught his attention. He approached slowly, crouching low behind a fallen log, eyes scanning every detail. For the first time in hours, he felt a flicker of curiosity mixed with caution. There was life here, he realized, and it was not entirely wild. Suddenly, movement caught his eye. A figure appeared in the clearing, a person, small and agile, moving with remarkable confidence and grace. John froze, heart racing. The figure was a woman, her dark hair tied back, her clothing simple but practical, blending seamlessly with the surroundings. She carried a small bundle, and her eyes, sharp and alert, seemed to notice every detail of the forest as she moved. John's instincts told him to stay hidden, yet he could not look away. He had never encountered anyone like her in these woods, and the sight filled him with a mixture of awe, curiosity, and caution. The woman paused, crouched near a cluster of bushes, and examined the ground carefully. John realized that she was not just moving through the forest, she was reading it, understanding it, and interacting with it in ways he had only begun to imagine. Her movements were precise, deliberate, and purposeful. She was hunting, gathering, or perhaps tracking something. John admired her skill from a distance, recognizing in her actions a mastery of the land that mirrored his own in some ways, yet seemed entirely foreign. He debated whether to reveal himself. His curiosity battled with caution. He knew that approaching her could be dangerous. He was an outsider, and the woman could see him as a threat. But at the same time, he felt a strange pull, an unspoken connection that made him want to communicate. He decided to wait and observe, hoping to understand her intentions before making any move. From his hidden position, he noticed small details. The way she checked the plants for edible leaves, the careful placement of stones to avoid disturbing the soil, and the way she listened to the forest as if it spoke to her directly. Hours seemed to pass in a matter of minutes as John watched her. The sun climbed higher, and the woman moved with purpose, collecting small items, examining the ground, and occasionally glancing in his direction, though he remained hidden. John felt a mixture of admiration and unease. He had spent most of his life alone in the wilderness, yet here was someone whose knowledge and confidence surpassed his own. He realized that his simple hunt for meat had led him into a world far more complex and fascinating than he had expected. At one point, she paused near a stream, crouching low to drink. John noticed her hands, steady and deliberate as she scooped water to her lips. She seemed aware of every detail of her surroundings, alert to sounds, smells, and movements. John marveled at her skill, recognizing in her actions a deep understanding of survival that he had spent years developing himself. Yet there was something more, an air of calm authority, a sense that she belonged here in a way he never could. It was humbling, and he felt a strange mixture of respect and apprehension. As the day wore on, the woman moved closer to where John was hidden. He held his breath, every muscle tense as she approached the edge of the clearing. Her eyes scanned the area, sharp and alert, and for a moment John feared she would notice him. But instead she paused, looked toward the trees, and then moved on, seemingly unconcerned. He realized that she was used to the presence of others in the forest, hunters, travelers, and animals alike, but she did not perceive him as an immediate threat. It was a small relief, yet it heightened his curiosity. Who was she? Where had she come from? And why was she alone in the forest? Eventually, John decided he could no longer remain hidden. He stepped forward slowly, making sure not to startle her. "Hello," he called softly, his voice steady but cautious. The woman froze, her eyes narrowing as she assessed him. John could feel the tension in the air, the unspoken communication between two people who had never met but were acutely aware of each other. He raised his hand slightly, showing he meant no harm. "I don't mean to intrude," he said. "I'm just a traveler looking for food." The woman studied him for a long moment. Her expression was unreadable, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. She gestured toward the ground, indicating that he should sit and remain still. John complied, carefully lowering himself onto the forest floor, keeping his hands visible. The woman moved closer, examining him with the same careful attention she had used to study the forest. She seemed to weigh his presence, determining whether he posed a threat or whether he could be trusted. John felt a mixture of tension and relief. He had hoped for understanding, but he knew that trust would not come easily. Over the next hour, the woman communicated with him in a series of gestures and sounds, pointing to the stream, the plants, and the small fire he had made. John realized that she was offering him food, water, and guidance without expecting anything in return. Her actions were deliberate, patient, and calm. He accepted her offerings, feeling gratitude and a growing sense of connection. For the first time in days, he felt a sense of hope that went beyond mere survival. The forest, which had seemed isolating and dangerous, now held a possibility he had never imagined, a chance for understanding, cooperation, and perhaps even friendship. As the afternoon faded into evening, John and the woman continued to communicate through gestures and simple words. He learned her name, though he could not pronounce it exactly, and she learned his. He discovered that she belonged to a group that lived in the surrounding lands, people who had survived and thrived in the wilderness for generations. Her knowledge of the forest, its plants, animals, and hidden paths was remarkable. John felt both humbled and fascinated. He had spent years learning to live alone in these woods, but she had grown up with the forest as her teacher, understanding it in ways he had never known. By nightfall, John realized that his hunt for meat had transformed into something far more significant. He was no longer simply a man seeking food. He had entered a world where survival was intertwined with respect, knowledge, and trust. The woman had shown him that the forest could provide, but only if one approached it with humility and care. He felt a deep sense of gratitude, mixed with awe, for the unexpected encounter that had shifted the course of his day, and perhaps his life. As the stars appeared in the clear night sky, John settled near the small fire she had helped him build. The forest around them was alive with sound, but he felt no fear. The woman sat across from him, calm and alert, her presence a reassuring anchor in the vast wilderness. He thought of the path that had led him here, from a simple desire for meat to an encounter that had challenged his understanding of the world, his skills, and his assumptions. The forest, he realized, held lessons far beyond hunting. It held the power to teach patience, respect, and the importance of connection. Sleep came more easily that night, not because John was exhausted, but because he felt safe in a way he had not felt for days. He had entered the forest seeking survival, and had found guidance, understanding, and an unexpected ally. The encounter with the woman marked a turning point, an introduction to a life that would challenge him, change him, and teach him that even the most solitary paths could lead to connections that shaped the heart, mind, and spirit. The days that followed were unlike anything John had ever experienced. Life in the wilderness had always been a solitary existence, governed by his own routines and instincts. But now, under the guidance of the woman he had met, everything felt different. Her presence was a constant reminder that survival was not just about skill or strength. It was about awareness, respect, and cooperation. At first, John struggled to adjust. Simple tasks he had once done automatically, building a fire, gathering food, or navigating through the forest, required him to pay attention in entirely new ways. The forest no longer felt like a place he could dominate. It was a teacher, and she was its messenger. The woman, whose name he now pronounced as best he could as Nakamis, moved through the forest with an ease that John found both intimidating and inspiring. She could find edible roots hidden beneath layers of leaves, spot signs of animals long before they appeared, and understand the subtle patterns of wind and sound that revealed the presence of predators or other travelers. John admired her skill but also felt the weight of his own limitations. He realized that his life had been one of routine and habit, while hers was one of observation, adaptation, and constant learning. Every day with her reminded him how much he still had to understand. One morning, as they moved through a dense part of the forest, John attempted to follow her silently, trying to match her movements and predict her next steps. He stumbled over a hidden root, snapping it with a loud crack. Nakamis turned quickly, eyes sharp, and raised a hand to signal him to stop. John froze, heart pounding. She approached him slowly, her expression calm but firm. In that moment, he understood that the forest was a place where mistakes could be costly. She gestured to the root and then to him, teaching him without words the importance of careful, deliberate movement. John nodded, taking in her lesson, and tried again to move more quietly, his senses stretched to their limits. Food remained a constant concern. While Nakamis could find roots, berries, and small game with ease, John's body was accustomed to larger meals and the routines of his old life. Learning to survive on what the forest provided was a challenge. He discovered that patience was essential. Rushing often led to failure. He spent hours observing how Nakamis set traps for rabbits, placed snares in narrow paths, and used small decoys to attract birds. At first he made mistakes, setting traps incorrectly or failing to notice subtle signs of animal movement. But Nakamis was patient, correcting him gently but firmly. Over time, he began to see the logic in her methods, understanding that survival was as much about thoughtfulness as it was about strength. Despite these lessons, the emotional strain of his new reality was significant. John had been a man of solitude, used to relying solely on himself. Now, he depended on someone else not just for guidance but for survival. He struggled with feelings of inadequacy, frustration, and vulnerability. There were times when he questioned whether he could adapt, whether he could earn Nakamis's trust, or even whether he belonged in this world at all. The forest, which had once felt like home, now seemed indifferent to his struggles. Yet through it all, Nakamis remained a steady presence, showing him that perseverance and humility were as important as any skill. One afternoon, while they were collecting roots near a stream, John noticed a subtle change in the forest. The wind shifted, carrying a scent that he could not identify. His heart quickened as he realized it could indicate the presence of other people or danger. Nakamis noticed it as well. She signaled for him to stay quiet and led him to a small thicket, crouching low behind the bushes. John's pulse raced as they waited, hidden in silence. He realized that life in the forest was unpredictable. Threats could appear without warning, and survival depended on attentiveness and quick thinking. Hours seemed to pass in silence, the forest holding its secrets close. Eventually, the presence he had sensed moved on, leaving John both relieved and shaken. Nakamis gestured to him, showing approval for his stillness and patience. In that moment, he understood that every experience in the forest was a lesson, not just about the land, but about his own character and resilience. He felt a growing respect for Nakamis and a deeper appreciation for the delicate balance of life around him. The forest was both teacher and mirror, reflecting his strengths and weaknesses with unflinching honesty. John also began to notice the small, subtle ways in which Nakamis had adapted to her environment, ways he had never considered. She carried no heavy pack, yet had everything she needed. She could move silently across uneven ground, sensing hidden roots, stones, and animal tracks. She could use plants for food, medicine, and tools with remarkable efficiency. Every day with her felt like entering a world he had only glimpsed before. A world where survival was not about domination, but about understanding, adaptation, and harmony. John realized that his old life, while sufficient in its own way, had prepared him only partially for this experience. At night, John found that the forest demanded a different kind of endurance. Sleeping in a small clearing near the fire, he listened to the sounds of nocturnal creatures and the rustle of leaves in the wind. The darkness brought with it both fear and wonder. He had spent countless nights alone in the wilderness, but now, with Nakamis nearby, he felt a mix of security and unease. He respected her knowledge, but he also understood that the forest could be unforgiving at any moment. These nights became lessons in patience, attentiveness, and trust. Over the next several days, John faced physical challenges that tested his endurance. Climbing steep hills, crossing cold streams, and navigating dense underbrush forced him to rely on his strength and his developing skills. He learned to pace himself, to read the signs of the forest, and to conserve energy for when it was truly needed. Nakamis guided him through these lessons with patience, demonstrating techniques and offering encouragement. At first he struggled, feeling clumsy and uncertain, but slowly his confidence grew. He began to see progress in his movements, in his ability to anticipate animal behavior, and in his understanding of the forest's patterns. Even with progress, tension remained. John knew that he was still vulnerable in ways he could not fully anticipate. The forest held hidden dangers, snakes, predators, and sudden changes in weather that could threaten life at any moment. Nakamis never underestimated these dangers, teaching him constantly to be alert and mindful. John learned to respect not just the land but the power and unpredictability of nature. He began to understand that survival was not just a physical endeavor, but a mental and emotional one, requiring patience, observation, and humility. During this time, John also began to learn about Nakamis herself. Through gestures, simple words, and shared experiences, he learned that she had grown up in this region, learning the ways of the forest from her family. Her knowledge was not simply skill, it was culture, history, and tradition passed down through generations. John realized that he was not just learning survival techniques, he was being introduced to a worldview that saw humans as part of the natural world, not separate from it. This understanding changed the way he moved, thought, and interacted with the forest. Despite these lessons, John experienced moments of doubt and frustration. His body ached, his progress was slow, and the isolation of life in the wilderness occasionally weighed heavily on his spirit. He missed the familiarity of his cabin, the predictability of his previous life, and the comfort of routine. Yet these challenges also forced him to grow. He began to see that true strength was not measured by independence alone, but by the ability to adapt, learn, and trust. Nakamis became both mentor and mirror, reflecting his limitations while guiding him toward growth. One evening, as they rested near a small stream, John reflected on the transformation he had undergone. Just days ago, he had entered the forest seeking a simple goal, meat for survival. Now he had found a teacher, a guide, and a path to understanding a world far more complex than he had imagined. He felt gratitude, humility, and a sense of awe for the life lessons that had come to him through struggle, patience, and the guidance of Nokomis. The forest had become more than a place of survival. It had become a place of growth, reflection, and connection. As night fell, John lay near the fire, feeling a mixture of exhaustion and accomplishment. He had learned to move with care, observe with attention, and respect the world around him. He had faced physical, emotional, and mental challenges that had tested his endurance and character. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, he understood that he was not alone. The lessons of the forest and the presence of Nokomis had given him tools, knowledge, and a sense of resilience he had never known. In that quiet moment, as the stars glittered above and the forest whispered around him, John understood that survival was only part of the journey. The true challenge lay in growth, understanding, and the ability to navigate a world that demanded humility, patience, and respect. He had entered the forest as a man seeking meat, and he was learning to emerge as someone capable of understanding life in a deeper, more meaningful way. Days had passed since John first met Nokomis, and in that time, his understanding of the forest and of himself had deepened in ways he could not have imagined. The wilderness, once a place of solitude and simple survival, had become a school, and Nokomis had been his teacher. She had guided him through challenges that tested not only his physical abilities, but also his patience, resilience, and humility. He had learned to see the forest differently, to read its signs, respect its rhythms, and recognize the delicate balance of life that existed all around him. By now, John could move with confidence through the forest. He had learned to track animals silently, find edible plants, and anticipate the behavior of both prey and predator. Yet, the most profound lessons were not about hunting or survival. They were about connection, trust, and perspective. Nokomis had taught him to observe before acting, to respect the land as a partner rather than a resource to be dominated. Each day, John discovered that true survival was more than food and shelter. It was understanding the world and his place in it. One morning, as sunlight filtered through the trees, John watched Nokomis prepare food near the stream. He noticed how careful she was in selecting roots, how precise her movements were when gathering water, and how she seemed to communicate silently with the forest itself. He marveled at her knowledge, realizing that every small action was a combination of skill, observation, and tradition. John reflected on his own life, the years he had spent hunting and trapping alone, and recognized that while he had survived, he had never truly understood the land the way she did. As they moved together through the forest that day, John felt a growing sense of harmony. He had learned to anticipate the patterns of animals, the changes in the weather, and the subtle signs that indicated danger or opportunity. For the first time, survival no longer felt like a struggle, it felt like a collaboration. He and Nokomis had developed an unspoken rhythm, each aware of the other's presence, abilities, and intentions. Trust, he realized, was essential in the forest. It was what had allowed him to endure the hardships of the past days and what would guide him in the days ahead. Despite this growing confidence, John could not ignore the knowledge that he would eventually have to return to his old life. His cabin, his routines, and his familiar surroundings awaited him beyond the forest. Yet he felt that leaving now would not be a simple return. It would be a transformation. The lessons he had learned, the patience he had cultivated, and the respect he had developed for the natural world had changed him profoundly. He understood that he could never again view survival as merely a matter of skill or instinct. It was, he realized, about awareness, humility, and adaptation. As the sun reached its peak, John and Nokomis stopped by a quiet clearing to rest. He watched her, noting the calm confidence in her movements, and thought about the countless lessons she had imparted through example, gesture, and action. She had taught him to observe rather than act impulsively, to listen to the wind and the animals, to read the land with patience and care. Each lesson had been subtle, yet powerful, shaping not only his abilities but also his mindset. He realized that these teachings would stay with him long after he left the forest. During their time together, John had also come to understand Nakamis in a deeper sense. He had glimpsed her life, her knowledge, and her connection to the land. She carried the history of generations in her actions, the wisdom of her people, and the skill of a life spent in harmony with the forest. John felt both humility and gratitude. He recognized that he had been a guest in her world, and she had treated him not as an intruder, but as someone capable of learning and growth. Her patience, guidance, and quiet authority had allowed him to survive and to see the world differently. As evening approached, the forest took on a golden glow. The sounds of the wilderness shifted, birds quieted, the wind softened, and small nocturnal creatures began their nightly routines. John sat by the fire he had built with Nakamis, feeling the warmth of the flames and the weight of reflection. He thought about the path that had led him here, from a simple desire for meat to an encounter that had transformed his understanding of survival, trust, and connection. Every challenge, mistake, and lesson had contributed to a deeper understanding of himself and the world around him. That night, as John lay near the fire, he reflected on the journey he had undergone. He thought of the fear and uncertainty he had felt when he first became lost, the frustration of hours spent tracking elusive prey, and the humility required to trust Nakamis in a world he had always believed he could navigate alone. He realized that growth often came through struggle, and that lessons learned through experience were more valuable than any book or training. The forest had tested him, shaped him, and ultimately taught him what it meant to be truly alive and aware. John also recognized that his understanding of the world had changed. He had come to appreciate the intricate balance of life, the interdependence of all creatures, and the importance of respecting the natural order. Hunting, once a purely practical task, had become a study in observation, patience, and responsibility. He no longer sought to conquer the forest, but to move with it, to learn from it, and to honor its rhythms. This realization gave him a sense of peace he had never known. Over the following days, John and Nakamis continued their routines, gathering food, navigating the forest, and sharing quiet moments of understanding. They communicated with gestures, simple words, and shared observation, forming a bond that transcended language. John learned to anticipate her actions, to understand her intentions, and to move in harmony with her and the land. The forest, once a place of isolation and danger, had become a shared space of learning, trust, and mutual respect. Eventually, John knew the time would come to return to his cabin. He thought about the journey home with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. He carried with him not only the skills he had developed, but also the wisdom and perspective he had gained. The forest had taught him lessons that extended far beyond survival, the value of patience, the importance of trust, and the profound connection between humans and the natural world. These lessons, he realized, would shape the rest of his life. On the morning of his departure, John prepared to leave the forest with a sense of gratitude and reflection. Nakamis accompanied him to the edge of the woods, where the familiar landscape began to emerge. He looked back at the dense trees, the winding streams, and the small clearings where he had learned so much. He thought of Nakamis and the patience she had shown, the knowledge she had shared, and the guidance that had allowed him to endure. He understood that his life had been irrevocably changed by this encounter. As he stepped out of the forest and toward his cabin, John felt a new sense of confidence and humility. He knew that the skills he had developed would serve him well, but more importantly, he carried a deeper understanding of the world and his place within it. The wilderness had tested him, challenged him, and taught him lessons that extended far beyond survival. He had entered the forest seeking meat, but he left with insight, respect, and a profound connection to life itself. Back at his cabin, John reflected on his journey. He rebuilt his daily routines, hunted with a greater awareness, and moved with a careful respect for the land. He thought often of Nakamis, her guidance, and the lessons she had imparted without words. The forest had become more than a place to live. It had become a teacher, a mirror, and a source of wisdom. John knew that he would carry these lessons for the rest of his life, shaping the way he saw the world and interacted with it. In the evenings, when the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, John would sit by his fireplace, thinking back on the forest and the woman who had changed his life. He realized that every challenge, every mistake, and every lesson had contributed to a deeper understanding of himself and the world around him. The journey had been difficult, unpredictable, and at times frightening, but it had been invaluable. He understood now that life was not simply about survival. It was about learning, growing, and forming connections that enriched the spirit and mind. In the end, John had found more than meat, more than shelter, and more than survival. He had found guidance, wisdom, and a deeper understanding of what it meant to live in harmony with the world. The encounter with Nakamis, the lessons of the forest, and the challenges he had faced had transformed him into a man who saw beyond the surface of life. He had learned that every experience, no matter how small or challenging, carried the potential for growth, insight, and connection. John's journey concluded not with a dramatic event, but with quiet reflection. He had entered the forest as a man seeking something practical, and he emerged as someone changed, wiser, and more aware. The wilderness had been his teacher, Nakamis his guide, and the experiences they shared had left an indelible mark on his life. He knew that the lessons he had learned would continue to influence him, guiding his choices, actions, and understanding of the world. The forest, the woman, and the challenges he had faced had given him a gift far greater than he could have imagined, an understanding of life itself.